We'll go live for now. So, greetings in the love and in the light of the one infinite creator. I'm Andre, and today joined by Simon Michaux, who will be rebutting claims made in a recent bit by Just Have a Think. All right, take it away, Simon.
Hello. So can you all hear me okay? And can I share my screen? Let me do a quick test. Make sure it all works well. Andre, is this working?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to present my chair squeaks. I'm just changing chairs. So, all right. I'm going to present, this is round 14 of presenting to critics. So the first piece of criticism I've heard in the last few weeks is I've got the energy return on energy invested wrong for wind and solar and renewables in general. Now, this is actually something that's actually come out in a few papers recently. I think there's been a few papers that have come out that are incorrect themselves, but they've completely corrupted this whole field. I don't believe there is a good study for energy return on energy invested. Cost and market prices usually tangle up with material needs and everything goes wrong. I didn't use it. I actually didn't use ERoEI in my calculations at all. We'll get to that in a moment. What I think has to happen is an energy return on energy invested study has to be done in this context. Whatever system we're actually going to share, we're going to have to say compare coal to, say, solar, and solar to wind, and then to nuclear and all that.
Mm-hmm.
That has to be compared all the way back to the raw materials extracted out of the ground, including all infrastructure that is support and everything associated with constructing that infrastructure. And it gets very, very complicated. So that's the first half, and that would be the second half. And we need to be able to answer the black boxes down the bottom. You know, what is the consistent quantity of current of quality, sinusoidal wave, voltage without power spikes, delivered to the point of application? How do we do that? And solar and wind, for example, are highly intermittent, and they need a buffer. That much is clear. And how big that buffer is, we'll be discussing shortly. But if you include that buffer, then everything goes negative. But because this is a hall of mirrors, I actually didn't use it. So what did I do? Now, I'm going to go through very quickly the scope of work that I did do as to I can answer some questions properly. I did a baseline calculation where I wanted to phase out the existing system as it is at the moment. So I looked at the calendar year of 2018. 1.4 billion vehicles traveled a little under 16 trillion kilometers in that calendar year. And I also then mapped out how much energy we consumed in that year. So the three fossil fuels, we've seen this before, so I'll rocket through it. There's the transport system. I set all short-range vehicles to be electric vehicles. We'll need 65 terawatt hours of batteries. Everything heavy should be hydrogen fuel cells. Aircraft will go to biofuel, bioplastics. Petrochemical fertilizers had no viable replacement. Electric power generation and the heating of buildings and steel manufacture using coal, all substituted for non-fossil fuel systems. We would need that amount of electrical power to charge the batteries and that amount of power to make hydrogen for the hydrogen fleet. So we needed 37,289 terawatt hours in addition to the existing system. Now, that number has moved in a couple of times over the last few months. Every time someone comes up with a genuine criticism that is actually worthwhile, I'll go away and redo all my calculations. And that's happened about 4 or 5 times. And if we were then to generate that power with non-fossil fuel systems, here's our options. The elephant in the room is wind and solar is intermittent. And it needs a buffer. How big is that buffer? We will be talking about that shortly. I think this is a blind spot that everyone's missed. And I think until we sort this out, wind and solar is actually not viable. Here are the numbers graphically. We've seen all this before. This is to give anyone who hasn't seen this work context of what I'm sort of talking about. Right. So the energy mix and the number of power stations. How do we get the energy mix? Well, ARENA 2022 released a report. It was a really nice report, and in it they actually had a prediction of, in 2050, what the energy mix could be. Now, could be. No one can really predict the future, but this is actually probably the best prediction for the future I've found. And so we've got like about 70% wind and solar, a bit of hydro, a bit of everything. They actually had part of the gas industry included in there. I've taken that away. And so I came up with this energy split, where wind and solar represent now the lion's share of energy generation, which is what is believed to be for the future. So I went to this site called Global Energy Observatory, which actually collected about the data for about 10,000 power stations for 2018, and looked at what was actually produced in 2018 and what were their metrics. I was able to run some statistics. So what's actually seen here is, the maximum, the minimum, the standard deviation, and the average. And we've got the amount of power produced by the average plant, but we've also got the operating hours across the year. So this is what they actually delivered, not what they promised, not what was theoretically possible, what they actually delivered. For each of the systems, coal, gas, nuclear, wind, solar, PV, what have you. And so it was the basis of this information that I was able to project this. So the amount of electricity was delivered to the power grid with coal, gas, and oil. Take that away, and we're now going to look at it delivering that with wind, solar, and hydroelectric, sorry. And based on the performance of the average system in the year 2018, energy return and energy invested was not used at all. It was actually power delivered by data reported. And so I came up with this calculation. So we have our split, and based on that split, the amount of power that'll have to go into each system, and the amount of power produced by a single average plant, and that gave us the number of plants. And so we end up with 37,289 terawatt hours of power in addition to what's actually happening now. And we will need 607,052 power stations of average size. The current fleet is 46,423. So that's considerably different.
So
yeah,
I just had some questions. Because you were saying about that total energy out, was that what you were, because the that British critic was saying that kind of he was claiming that you were doing your energy calculations based on the total amount of energy in the primary feedstock.
Nope, not true.
Yeah. So I'm just wanted to clarify that
Okay.
you were showing like a rebuttal to it by showing how much was actually produced, and then so that would be you are looking at how much energy is actually used, and then using that as the metric.
So what's happened is these people have either misunderstood the report or they're misrepresenting it. The first couple of chapters, I did look at fossil fuels consumed and the energy efficiencies thereof. But when I got to the calculation end of things, I looked at what was delivered to the market, to the grid directly. And if we had to deliver it directly from another source, how would we do that? Right. So I'm not actually using primary energy or energy return on energy invested or misallocating thermal losses for fossil fuels at all, because I just don't use them.
Right.
What electrical power was delivered to the grid, remove that, insert a new system.
Right. Okay. Great. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that for our audience.
So I'm looking at these different presentations that actually these Nafeez Ahmed's article did the same thing, where they're actually misrepresenting what I actually said and did, and that's a little unfortunate. And sometimes I wonder how, if it's a disingenuous, like is this really a way of redirecting me? So anyway, so this is what I actually did.
Yeah,
it's crude, it's primitive, but to be honest, I haven't actually seen anything better still. All right. So the stationary storage buffer, how big should it be? This is the saw point. This was actually unheard of back in 2018 when I first started looking at this. No one had actually talked about this at all. It didn't exist. And getting hold of information was really hard. And over time, I found that this simply hasn't been looked at very well. All right. So yeah.
Just in relation to that, because that the British critic was also saying that he was thinking that we can just overbuild, like I don't
Can we,
know.
guys?
So I was wondering if you had by any chance run the calculations to see if we can overbuild instead of having a buffer.
I
Uh,
have.
okay,
And
great,
what I'm about to present in about 10 slides' time
awesome,
is
awesome.
a scenario where I actually looked at a 3 times build. And the simple answer is it's not really going to work. But it all comes back to how big is this buffer? And that's our energy mix at the moment. Wind and solar represents most of the power we need. So, but we look at just that. And I had 2 references at the time. One was 48 hours plus 10%, but I found another one for 1 month for the full system. And I was looking at 4 weeks for just wind and solar, or 28 days. Now I'm going to show you some charts at the moment why I think even that is not big enough. So this is how we got these numbers. So they're the 2 numbers that you'll see in the calculations. This will be red in the graph at the end, and this will be blue. There was a very sophisticated report called Net Zero America that was released about a year after my work, and they looked at what would be required for America to go net zero, and they looked at how much power buffer they would need, and they looked at the daily dispatch load. So this solid line here, is the demand load, and underneath it you've got your supply. Sometimes the supply exceeds demand, and sometimes it's the other way around. Their basic plan was, when it exceeds, capture that, store it, and then release it when demand exceeds supply. And generally they only need to keep it for a couple of days. And in terms of supply and demand management, to make sure everything smooths out, this is actually all that's needed. So they recommend 5 to 7 hours of power buffer storage, and this is what all my critics are saying. This is all that's needed. Question: the sun in winter is not as strong as the sun in summer. True or false? Right.
Yeah.
Right. So what I'm coming across here is these guys have done some good work. It was just a fairly serious question that no one else has really thought about. So I don't want to be rude or disparaging to other works, because this is complicated enough as it is, without taking things out of context. So this is how we do things for now. This is net power exchanges in 2021 in Europe. Look at Germany right in the center. So when Germany goes down, the Europe goes with it. Right. And so no nation actually produces just enough power. We either produce too much or too little, and then we trade it. And this is how we buffer all networks. So all networks get exactly what they need by trading power between them. So far, it's almost always using fossil fuel source power, usually gas. Now, most renewable power grids are balanced from fossil fuel systems. For example, the wind in power systems in Denmark are balanced for power from Germany and power from Sweden. Right, usually gas. We've never had to actually run a non-fossil fuel system in a self-sufficient manner, especially a large one. Now, natural gas and power generated by it, that is our existing power buffer. Take that away, and we can't balance our power systems. And this is something that the existing strategic planners for the future of all kinds have completely missed. Now, I've put this out there to people, and it has not been able to be knocked off the perch yet. So that, I believe, is correct. So let's look at this. This is solar radiation for Berlin in the year 2015. And so you might notice in winter, we have a whole lot less solar energy than we do in summer. Now, if this represented 35% of the energy mix for the world, and we needed to smooth it out, that'd be this red dotted line. So anything above that dotted line would have to be captured and stored, and then released slowly below the dotted line, where the grey becomes the buffer. Electrical power has to be stable 100% of the time at the same frequency, and the same voltage and the same current, and it has to be stable. Otherwise, our electronics cannot cope. Right, so we would need to catch the power over about 6 months, store it for another 6 or 7 months, and then release it slowly over a 6-month period. That is 1 month, that little red box. So even 1 month for 28 days, that's nowhere near enough, right? This basic concept of the amount of power that we need to store, it's just not enough. And we need to go back to the drawing board and actually change something fundamental. There is 48 hours. That's clearly not enough. That little red line you see there is 6 hours.
Wow.
Right? It's just not. The phrase "it's not going to work." It's just it does a completely different job. So here is and you might sort of say, "Oh, Germany's too far north. If we did it at the equator, we'd get like a better result." Well, here's a case study from Spain. In Spain, the sun shines much better. 2 case studies. This was done by Ewan Mearns, who has done the most sophisticated work of this kind that I've seen so far. Okay, the 2 months in June and month in November, summer and winter. So this is the actual power that was delivered by a concentrated solar power plant in Spain. Now, this is actually part of a wider grid, and that grid's balanced generally with gas and coal. But if this was a standalone system, it would be a 670 megawatt system. And even in summer, you needed a bit of storage. The dark orange is the buffer that would be needed from storage. And what Newman found was for the month of November, and just November, they would need 16.2 days of buffer capacity.
Wow. And we know December is even darker than November.
Yeah. So again, it's something that we just hadn't, fossil fuels do many things for us in the background, and we just don't know. It's like a hidden subsidy. So that brings us to wind. The wind is highly variable. The UK Parliament did a study in 2014, and they found that power production was so erratic it couldn't be predicted. Didn't help they got hit with a couple of unseasonal storms that completely wiped everything out. Something more reasonable is in this chart down the bottom, which is actually about a year later. And again, this came from Ewan Mearns, who put this together. So September, October, and November 2015. So look at these variation peaks. They're massive. So that little line there, let's say if we were to smooth this into one line, this represents 35% of the energy mix. That'd be that dotted line or something like it. That red line that you're seeing there is a 6-hour buffer.
Wow.
6 hours is not going to do it, guys. 28 days is not going to do it. It's what I'm getting at is wind and solar are so variable that if we don't work a way around this, it's not viable. Now, we don't have the technology to store this much power. We'll talk about that in a moment. What might be a more sensible thing to do is to work out an electrical technology that can handle variable power. Because if we can do that and adjust society accordingly, we all of a sudden wouldn't need the power buffer. And that would then come back to a smaller amount of materials. We'll look at that simulation shortly. So here is 5 countries in Europe: Sweden, Denmark, United Kingdom, France, and Germany, across those months. Again, this is Ewan's work, Ewan Mearns, top chap, an excellent analyst. So what you're seeing here is, well, for a start, these peaks you're seeing and troughs, they vary up to 48%. And this was normal weather. And so you also had these lulls. There's 4 lulls on this chart where things actually went below the point where everything had to shut down. Right. Now, what you're also looking at is when you actually see a peak in one area, you're seeing a peak in all areas. So when Sweden has a peak and then a trough, you can't balance that with wind power from Denmark or Germany because they've got the same problems. Now, solar has the same issue where when one solar farm is not doing so well, it means they're not getting solar radiance, but every solar farm in the region, like the hemisphere, is having the same problem because it's winter. Right, so wind has another similar problem. So you can't balance wind against wind or solar against solar, and they're so variable and dominated by the weather, you can't balance them off against wind versus solar either.
Oh, yeah, that's what I was going to say, because some people argue that there's more wind in the winter, and so that balances the solar.
So it's so variable, though, you can't pin it down to the point where you can rely on anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's the weather.
Right.
So the United States Department of Energy took hold of my work, and they did an internal audit. I've been fielding several phone calls from them. They are most displeased because they feel they've been let down by the people who are advising them. So this was the result of their audit. They did a full year of renewable energy generation capacity factors in the largest grid that they had that supplies 100 million people. So this is just the wind and solar components of that. And they found my work to be conceptually correct. That is, solar underperformed 6 months of the year, and wind underperformed, I think it's 4 months of the year. So not only were the capacity factors low, but it turns out both wind and solar capacities reach low points at precisely the seasonal worst possible times. Wind at the peak of summer and demand, and solar at the peak of winter demand. And so, in practical terms, the information I got, solar PV, this is a global average when I put it all together, solar PV was producing power 11.4% of the calendar year, right?
Well,
and wind was producing 24.9% of the calendar year.
So it is the 11.4, like, is that like at the rated capacity? Because I mean, I'm sure it produces more, but just not at its full.
So,
or the equivalent of at its rated capacity.
You'd have to actually sort of, it's got to be producing within a window of efficiency. It's got to be above a certain amount and below a certain amount. For example, when the wind goes too much, the wind turbine shuts down. But in terms of actual electrical power delivered to the grid where that can be sold, it was 11.4 for solar and it was 24.9 for wind.
So it's the solar I'm wondering about. Oh, so I understand with the wind, but about the solar, does it have the same that it needs to be in a certain range in order to contribute to the grid?
It's got to be above. I forget the specs at the moment, but it's got to be above a particular specification.
Oh, okay.
Right? Because the grid, remember, has to be stable. It has to actually have enough power to balance out. And if it's not, they would rather shut the whole thing down because then they get what's the equivalent of a brownout.
Oh, right.
Right. So you've got the day-night cycle. Then you've got the less solar radiance in winter versus summer. And then you've got overcast days where you're just not getting enough power to actually move the needle. It's a complicated business. This is tough. Renewable systems so far have operated just fine based around the idea that we've had solar panels and wind turbines to actually solar panels and wind turbines. We've had something to balance it off against. We've never had the situation where we've tried to balance it ourselves internally.
So for a home system where you're charging some batteries, would it be like kind of more efficient there than for a grid system, because the grid system is more finicky?
But you can actually manage the home system yourself, right? If you don't have power in your batteries, you just don't have a certain application. You're not demanding power. You actually go out and check whether you got the power, and so you've got a variable power demand that you can manage. You're controlling both sides of the balance sheet, demand and supply, to match up. But yes, all our delicate electronics like computers, if we don't have clean sinusoidal power, those electronics get destroyed.
Right.
So, and when we're managing a grid is the most complicated electrical engineering logistical task we've had yet. And it happens in the background. The people that do it are quite amazing, and we don't give them the credit that they're due, because it just happens in the background. And as long as the power comes out of the wall, we don't care. So, unfortunately, that is true. All right. So what this is actually showing, the idea that there is a massive variation in the seasons. And I had to argue with this with people in the beginning. 5 to 7 hours, that's all you need. And then I said, yeah, but what about in winters? Oh, that doesn't exist. Well, you look at this, it does exist. And yeah, so the buffer is large. Now I've got 28 days. That was just based on a reference. That clearly is also too small. The real number could be, twice that, 3 times that. Who knows? It'll be a lot. And my basic premise is the amount of power storage we need to make this work exceeds our technological capability. And so instead of flogging ourselves to try and do it, we should think of something else. That's what I'm trying to say here, I suppose. All right, moving on. Pumped hydro storage is how we store power at the moment. And this is actually the rebuttal that I'm sort of hearing at the moment. So we're not going to use batteries, we use pumped hydro. Why would we use anything else? So here's our basic types of storage. It can be mechanical, electrical, chemical, or thermal. But at the moment, the chart on the bottom right-hand corner, most power, like 99% of it, is actually pumped hydro at the moment. It is easily the cheapest and most effective way of storing power. And which is why I guess the prevailing consensus is, let's just use pumped hydro if we need to use lots of it. Well, our policymakers believe they want to use batteries because they're more flexible. We'll get to that in a moment. So I went through this. This was actually sort of one of the. I get flamed a lot in the media, and this is one of the things that came back. And it says we actually have. There was this one site that said we've got 610,000 stations worldwide suitable for pumped hydro storage. This is not a problem, right? And so 530,000 possible sites in this Australian. So I actually went through this a couple of years ago, where I started to look at. You might look at Europe. There's not a lot going in terms of pumped hydro storage sites. It doesn't work very well, and so I actually went through this and I actually sort of tried to actually get some of these sites and look at it. And I got taken out to the woodshed and said, this is politically unacceptable. You must not do this, right? Because you'd have to rezone land and you're never allowed to do it. Anyway, let's say we all put a gun to people's heads and say, you're going to do this or we're all going to starve to death in the dark. So, all right, let's look at this. And so what was the net capacity storage for each of these sites? And the ones I looked at, there were logistical problems with some of them, but let's say we overcome a lot of those. Pumped hydro is about between 75 and 81% efficient in the storage of energy in the round trip. My problem is how much water we will tie up in doing this. So watch this math. Let's say we take 28 days and we need to hit the 2,192 terawatt hours for the year. A flow of 100 cubic meters of water per second through a generator, operating at, say, 90% efficiency, which is pretty good, with a head of, say, 570 meters. Now, that is average. Some are bigger, some are smaller. But that will yield 500 megawatts. So 500 megawatt hours will need 360,000 cubic meters of water. Now, if we assume 81% efficiency, the best at the top end of the window, we will need this amount of water. So to have this amount of megawatts, which is 2,192 terawatt hours, will require this amount of water, and we're going to convert that to kilometers cubed, or 1,949 kilometers cubed of fresh water.
Wow!
And now things are going to get ugly. Global annual freshwater withdrawals in 2018 was a little under 4 trillion, or 3,990 kilometers cubed. And that's it in the graph.
So that's like half the fresh water we use.
Yeah, 49%. So to do this, we would have to somehow find, and we can't repurpose that water. If you're storing storage, you can't drink it, you can't use it, right? And which, see, most of it goes into agriculture, as you can sort of see. And so this is and we're drawing more fresh water than ever before. Not only do we have more population, but our society demands more resources of all kinds. And so the planet's just not going to take that.
Yeah.
So if we go back to our chart here, these are the sites around the world. Most of them are away from the sea, right? So the idea of using salt water from the ocean is only viable for the ones on the coast.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so that whole math has, and now we're back to the amount of volume. And we also tend to put our cities on the coast. So that's going to really, really throw a spanner in the works for our system. And instead, we should probably look at go back to the drawing board and look at why we need this power in the first place. But this chart here shows me, this is actually my problem with pumped hydro. The amount of fresh water it will tie up. There is a possible solution that might work that's not pumped hydro. I'll talk about that in a moment. So that brings us to batteries. Now, our policymakers, I talked to the Singapore government, and they thought, well, they think they only need a 5 to 7 hour buffer for a start. So they think the problem's relatively small. But they saw batteries that they were very flexible. They didn't need engineering scale-up problems for things like compressed air or spinning flywheels. And they could be put in any form. They could be put, in high-rise towers. They could be put in any configuration, in any weather, any geographical location. They weren't limited by anything. They could even put them underwater if they really wanted to. So they believed batteries were the future of all storage, especially when they saw the Tesla battery bank in Adelaide in Australia be so successful. There's all right, we want one of those. So, all right, and that's what they thought they were going to do, which is why I did what I did. I went with what they thought the plan was going to be. And these are the people who control our hedge funds. I don't talk to those guys, but their recommendations have gone through our policy leaders, and they told me what they think they were going to do. And so this is where all this work came from. So you're looking at these two tables about what battery chemistries did I actually use. So the IEA in 2021 will release a report where they gave an estimate of what the market in 2040 might be for batteries. And they did this for power storage, which is up the top here, and for electric vehicles down the bottom, light-duty vehicles like passenger cars and heavy-duty vehicles like buses and trucks if we go that far. Now, a couple of things. You might notice that lithium iron phosphate, or LFP, is already in the calculation in the lion's share.
Mm-hmm.
Now, power storage requirements are about 30 times the electric vehicle fleet as it is at the moment. And most of power storage is LFP. And most of the battery mass is in the heavy vehicles, and that's also LFP most of the time already. So that's what I'm saying, is I'm already using this stuff.
Right. Yeah, because the British critic was claiming that you didn't know about lithium iron phosphate, but you already included it. So
look, you have to remember, there's been about 4 or 5 very serious attempts to knock me off my perch at the moment. One came from Nafeez Ahmed, one came from Ugo Bardi, and then there's this guy. His name is Edward McTook, I think his name is. Anyway, so just have a think. So that's what they originally proposed. Now, they're not actually honouring what I've done. Now, the problem here is the first half is in that 1,000-page report. The second half I've been presenting in PowerPoints, and for the last 12 months, I've been attempting to get this work published. And we're in the final run of it, but it's been held up with delay after delay after delay. So there's no actual publication with these numbers in it. It's only the PowerPoint presentations where I show the numbers. And that has been a real problem. So maybe that's what their angle is. Anyway, so I've actually included in all my calculations these chemistries. And what's interesting is solid state batteries, which haven't actually taken off yet, but they're projected to take off. They're going to be a bit of a problem because they need germanium in large amounts.
Oh, wow.
So, all right, number of technology units. So this was actually mapping out the units in the fleet in 2018. Oh, man, someone's trying to ping me on Telegram. I apologize for that. And I can't shut off the notifications. So, yeah, okay. So the number of vehicles in the 2018 fleet, if they're electric vehicles, well, that's the electric vehicle fleet there, 1.39 billion, and there's the hydrogen fuel cells. And that's about, so 29 million hydrogen fuel cells do the vast bulk of the work of, and they exceed that they do more, 29 million H cells do more work than 1.39 billion electric vehicles. So the hydrogen economy must take precedence over the EV economy, even though it's many times smaller. So there's a wind turbine, 70% onshore, 30% offshore, as per what the IEA recommends. And solar panels, I took a 450 watt commercial grade solar panel, and that is standard across everything. And then there's our buffer power down the bottom. All right, so quantity of metals. What I looked at was 28 days and 48 hours. I'll get to the 6 hours in a moment. This is what I came up with. Everything was summed up by units and was compressed into these tables: aluminium, copper, zinc, etc. And so these are the amount of metals that we would need. And this is the mining production in 2019. And this was the number of years that we'd have to operate at the existing rates to hit these targets. And so we got like 195 years for copper. But also we've got problems like lithium is at 10,000 years and germanium is at 29,000 years. And what's going on here is these are trace elements and they're exotic and they're small in volume, but we want to now mine them like steel and copper. And it just doesn't reflect the geology involved.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, just that Edward Tuke guy was claiming that you included power lines in your copper, even though they're usually aluminum.
No, I didn't. I did not include power lines.
Very good.
I used the results that were handed out by the IEA, and they had like a kilograms per megawatt estimate for each metal. What they did have was each wind turbine, for example, has a cable as thick as your leg connecting the wind turbine to the power grid. And an offshore turbine has a longer cable, and that is copper. But the power lines that actually go between cities and across the infrastructure, they're aluminium at the moment. And no, I did not include that. I had a very, very simple calculation that didn't include everything, and the numbers are too small for that reason. Again, this is putting words in my mouth that didn't exist.
Well, thanks for clarifying.
Yeah. I'm trying to be polite here because it doesn't serve anyone's purpose being rude. So, all right, so that's production in a daily production. So obviously we'll open more mines. The calculation is showing that the metal that we need in the ground, and there are reserves as of 2022, economic reserves as stated by the USGS Geological Survey. And what we need, the reserves in the ground, for example, for all these battery chemistries says less than 5% for the amount of metal that we need to replace what's around us now. Now, you can make batteries out of something else, which I'll talk about later. That's actually a solution. Good luck replacing copper and nickel, though. And for every 1,000 deposits discovered, only 1 or 2 become mines. It takes between 15 and 20 years to develop a mine. And once the mine's producing, for every 10, 2 or 3 will shut down because of market conditions. Anyone who thinks this is easy or will be easy or quick or cheap, they're kidding themselves. All right, so here are the numbers graphically. Now we're going to get out of this and into the next step soon. So the red is the 28-day, with everything including the 28-day buffer. The blue is everything including the 48-hour buffer. The yellow is reported reserves, and the black is production. And this is just for the first generation of stuff, because wind turbines wear out, cars wear out. So is it 20 years? Is it 30 years? Whatever it is, after a period of time, we've got to do all this again with geological resources that took a long time to be created naturally. So here is the rare earth element. I couldn't find any reserves or resource data, so this is just the production. Again, this is showing that we are nowhere near able to deliver what we think we're going to do. Right, so this brings us to scenario N. I actually made this for Nafeez, Ahmed, and we actually had a discussion on email, and we met in debate on the Planet Critical podcast run by Rachel Donald, which will be up soon. And I found Nafeez was actually nice to talk to. And so I happily went off and made this calculation for him. So this is scenario N. And this is based on the ReThinkX Tony Sieber work, where they believe that if they have a 3 times build out of wind and solar and a 90% reduction of the car fleet, which is actually the passenger car fleet, and they'd only need the 6-hour buffer. So if we were to do that, what would that look like? Okay, and this is the results. This is the pink. And so the reported reserves are the yellow and the black is the mining, and that's a log scale. So the passenger car fleet is now automated AI, and we have like a shared fleet. Most people's cars sit in the driveway for most of the time. Most cars are idle. So if we shared cars and it was like they're all run by automated AI, we don't need so many cars, and so you could cut it back. But passenger cars are actually only a small part of this calculation. But we're going to cut that fleet back to 10% of what it is. The commercial van fleet was cut by 30%, so now 70% of the existing van fleet is now doing what the whole fleet does now. I don't think that would work because people who actually own commercial vans, they're not going to share. But maybe society will change. Trucks and trains are not affected at all because they're running flat out as it is. The distance traveled in a calendar year is the same. So 1/10 of the cars is now running flat out doing the same task of the existing passenger car fleet. So 1/10 of the vehicles are doing 10 times the amount of kilometers. So the batteries will wear out faster.
Mm-hmm.
Heavy trucks, buses, rail, and maritime shipping are unchanged. The power storage buffer is cut back to 6 hours. And there's a 3 times build out of wind and solar installed capacity. So what you have here is, all right, we're going to chew through most of our reserves, but we have just enough for the first generation. This doesn't account for demand for any other application apart from these vehicles. And these vehicles, these wind turbines and these solar panels, the existing engineering stuff like making alloys and manufacture, that's not allowed, that's not looked at. And once this generation wears out, what do we do then? So, all right, let's look at that. So I ran the calculation, scenario N. Now, the yellow here is the 3 times build out. So this is the installed amount of power. 3 times build out for wind and solar. We now have 1.6 million power stations. Now, the power plant fleet in 2018 was 46,423. So this is 35.2 times the size of the existing fleet. Right, so that's the implications of it. So if wind and solar are 70% of the mix to start with, and they're highly unreliable in terms of when they're producing, that telescopes out into this phenomenal number. So, yeah, you're still there, Andrew? Is my sound okay?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. So we have 1.6 million new average power stations. If we translate that to the metals, so this is the total metal we need for the 6-hour buffer plus everything else. And there's global metal production. And then there's just how many years of the 2019 production rate will we need to. Copper's now down to 16 years. We could probably do that if we got organized and if it was the way to go. So that copper's now taken off the board. Nickel's still there, though. Lithium definitely is there. Graphite's definitely there. And we go down to like germanium is still at 29,000 years. And anything over like a 20-year time frame is considered a problem because we think we're going to do this. They originally thought they were going to do this 100% by 2030, which is 6 years, 6 months away.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's production. When we go to reserves, 6-hour buffer versus reserves, it turns out only 2 reserves are actually lithium and cobalt. We don't have enough, but we will chew through most of the other reserves. So conceptually, Nafeez, his argument was if we go to a 6-hour buffer, the resource pressure would be much less. That is actually true, but I still think we've got a problem here. I don't believe the 6-hour buffer will work, but I ran the numbers just to look.
So we'll still need 200% copper?
No, what this is saying
okay.
is our reserves in the ground, our reserves are 226% of what we need.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so it's actually reversed. The problem is now production. Like, will the mining industry be able to expand to the point to deliver this in a 30 or 40-year time frame? The answer is no.
Okay, so the red is where we're showing insufficiency.
Yeah.
And it's showing how much is insufficient.
Yeah, and I've actually highlighted copper here in blue because copper was a problem I'd flagged before that we're not going to get around. I still think that is the case, but the outcome of the 6-hour buffer is copper becomes more manageable. Anyway, so this was the scenario N. Now, about the same time, Elon Musk, who I admire greatly, came up with another scenario. So I've called this scenario M. All batteries are made without lithium using a variant of the NMC 532 chemistry. And here's the outcome. All batteries are made without lithium. It's based on his Master Plan 3, what we saw on the Investor Day. I admire Musk. I admire what Elon's actually done. And to achieve what he says he's achieved is extraordinary, working in the battery chemistry field as a researcher. So the metal needed for all batteries will be based on NMC 532, except where we take lithium out. And as a tip to the hat to Musk and his team, it is assumed that the mass of the battery is smaller. So we just take lithium out and we don't telescope the proportions up to the density. So we're saying not only has he taken lithium out, but he's made it a higher energy density because he's cool.
Is that realistic?
Now, I haven't seen the actual outcome yet. I'm just going on what Musk has claimed.
Oh, okay.
Right. So this is a scenario M. Is it realistic? I don't know. So you can sort of see, again, we've got the same problem. So the red is what we would need, assuming these assumptions. The blue is 48 hours, yellow is reserves, and black is production. And so we've got the same problems as we had before. We don't have enough copper in the ground. Now we're at 34%. Reserves are 34% of what we need. And lithium's taken off, but we now have nickel is now under 5%. And so we won't have enough reserves in the ground.
So is this a variation of scenario N, where you do the 3 times build out? And
No. I made a hybrid NM together.
Okay.
So this was actually going back to the first scenario. I wish I could turn Telegram off. I'm sorry.
Okay. So it's scenario N, but with these new batteries.
Actually, no. So scenario N involves the 3 times build out. Scenario M is my first scenario, but it's just instead of all the different battery chemistries, I looked at everything is now NMC 532.
Oh, okay. So you still have the 28-day buffer here.
Yeah, and that's in red here. So scenario NM, which I think I'll present shortly. All right. So here's our production rate, and everything's red. Copper's at 104 years. Nickel is 1,389 years. And so all right, comparison of scenarios. I cut it out to save time, sorry. Scenario NM, which is the hybrid, is the brown, and that is the brown thing in there. That is where it's a combination of scenario N, where we've got a 3 times build out, 6-hour buffer, and 10% of the car fleet, but all batteries are now made out of NMC 532 that doesn't use lithium at all. So that's why. So the brown doesn't exist in here. See, right. So this is actually them all compared. The red is what I came up with first, with a 28-day buffer. The blue is the reference point of 48 hours. The pink is scenario N, 3 times build out plus a 6-hour buffer. The green is the Musk scenario. All batteries are now NMC 532 with no lithium. And NM is a combination of the pink and green together, and that's the brown. And then we get to reserves and production. So it's a bit messy, but it's showing across all these scenarios, we are not going to have enough minerals, remembering that we've got other tasks as well.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, all right, moving on. Now let's look at the substitution of aluminium into copper. So that this is actually one of the things I often hear, that we don't need copper, aluminium does the job. Right. So there are a number of material science issues. The aluminium has greater thermal expansion as a problem, and so when you connect it in solar panels, it might cause early failures. So aluminium is also only about 60% as conductive as copper. So you need like a thicker wire or and aluminium has a higher specific electrical resistivity than copper. It's far more brittle and prone to corroding. It's liable to crack and break, especially where there's movement and vibration involved. It's less flexible and doesn't take kindly to be bent around tight corners. Aluminium is also prone to galvanic corrosion where copper isn't, and that leads to a lot of problems. Aluminium wire requires to be 56% larger in cross-section than copper for carrying the same current. And aluminium also has a higher voltage drop over time. To avoid galvanic corrosion, which is a serious risk factor in damp conditions, aluminium requires a compound at the termination connector points, which is more expensive and higher risk. So what you've got here is aluminium can be used in some applications, but not all. Like they used to have copper wires in the transmission power lines, but they stopped that and they use aluminium instead because it's cheaper. Right, that's fine. But you're not going to be able to use aluminium in any delicate electronics or anything like any of the small electronics, and also an electrical power motor wound with aluminium wire is going to have problems in operation compared to a copper one.
Mm-hmm.
So now these things may be overcome because they're engineering problems, but we haven't overcome them yet, and they might take a long time to overcome. So the idea you can wave your hands and magically say, this will now be done. Sorry, I don't think so.
Yeah, it seems like with these natural properties, there's no way they could do it with like the wind turbines because there's the high vibration, there's the exposure to salt water. It's like it's just not going to work.
And so on and so forth. And these things mount up and become practical problems. The easier answer, logistically, is just not to have the unit at all. You know, and now we're downsizing, which is a different discussion. Hydrogen. I'm hearing that hydrogen we've got to go to a lot. So here's the chart that I put together to make hydrogen. So to make 1 kilogram of hydrogen through electrolysis, you need about 50 kilowatts of electricity and 10 liters of water. You then take that hydrogen, you compress it to a 700 bar tank, and then you get your fuel cell. You cannot make hydrogen out of salt water. It needs to be potable water of relatively high purity. Anything like salt will just gum up the electrolyzer unit, and it doesn't last very long. So you can't make hydrogen out of seawater. So the 52.5 kilowatt hours that go in to make the gas, 15 kilowatts come out the other end. So it's about 28% efficient. So let's say we take the 28-day buffer. We need 2,192 terawatt hours across the year. To make 1 kilogram of hydrogen, we need 15 kilowatt hours of electricity. So we need 146 million tons of hydrogen annually to deliver this buffer. This would be in addition to the hydrogen economy for transport. So if we're putting in 52.5 kilowatt hours to produce a single kilogram, sorry, I wish this guy had stopped that. We need 7,675 terawatt hours to produce that hydrogen. That's about 29% of the electrical power consumption in 2018. And according to the Green Transition simulations, it's about 20% increase on top of what we've already got. So to do that, according to the same energy mix that we went through before, we need an extra 124,934 power stations of average size. And you need power storage for the wind and solar, because that's wind and solar is 70% of that as well. And so here's how that breakdown looks like. So we've got 7,675 terawatt hours across this split, and this is how we get our average size power station down to 124,934. So that there, the wind and solar part, will need an extra 451 terawatt hours on top of that as a buffer. So this, again, we've got the same problem as before. So we need more buffer again. And that'll need a further 30 million tons of hydrogen, and then on it goes. So you're in this endless loop.
So basically hydrogen drastically increases our mineral requirements?
So if we were to actually do this, hydrogen drastically increases the size of the required power grid.
Oh, right. Because of the inefficiencies of creating hydrogen.
So we've got like 120 thousand new power stations, remembering the existing fleet's only 46,000. right?
Oh,
And then
wow.
you've got more buffer again and the more buffer again. And it's simpler to just say, look, let's look at why we need this in the first place, and can we change society and the engineering associated with that?
Right.
So here's what might work. I saw this at the Club of Rome, but I'm still trying to get the actual numbers. You can get iron powder and then burn it, and it comes in really hot, like 1,000 up to 1,000 degrees, which means we can use it for industrial. And so you burn it, and you get heat and power out of that, and then the results from that can be incinerated and converted back again. So it's actually a circular loop. Is this going to work? I don't know. I've yet to actually get the numbers for it, but the people promoting it seem to be pretty confident in their numbers. So yeah, okay. So that's something that might work, but I've yet to hear anyone talk about it yet. So let's see what happens. Right. Last thing. Can we make batteries out of something else? The answer is of course. This is a study that I use, looking at the different combinations atomically for an anode and a cathode combination. And so they've got these different combinations of what might work on an atomic theory level. And we come up with this chart. So you've got theoretical volumetric density on the y-axis and theoretical gravimetrical energy density on the x-axis. In this little bubble down in the left-hand corner is commercial lithium-ion batteries. And there's our sodium batteries in here. So what I believe the future will be fluoride ion batteries. This is the fluoride in your toothpaste. A lot of this stuff comes out of industrial waste. We're talking about sodium, chloride, zinc, fluoride, magnesium, sulfur. We don't need these exotic metals. So every battery chemistry I've seen, though, requires things around it, like copper, nickel, manganese, aluminium, and graphite. You don't, for example, have like a block of sodium. You've got other things with it. So what's the cathode made of and what's the anode made of? So this is what it theoretically is. To use these battery chemistries, it becomes a commercial secret. So my work mapped out the plan as it was in 2020. The outcome was the quantity and type of metals needed to replace the existing system, and it was apparent the mining industry was not going to be able to deliver. And any new plan should be required to pass this milestone. So that is, if the old plan didn't have enough minerals, and you can say, oh, we'll just make batteries out of sodium, you've then got to then show how much metal will we need for the new plan. So where do we get it? So then we get down to what is the metal content of a sodium battery in units of kilograms per megawatt across each metal. And that so far is a commercial secret. And for that reason, I can't use it until I get that information. Like, what am I going to do? And also, frankly, trying to actually sort of get anyone to discuss anything seriously other than lithium-ion chemistry at the moment is really hard. The industry is still hot for lithium, and they don't want to care. They don't want to listen to anything else. So, all right. So that's the actual presentation there. So if I can just, where are we?
Unshare screen.
Stop sharing. Okay.
Wow. Okay. Cool. Wow.
Questions?
Well, that's amazing. You got it all in there. Yeah, we have, I think, 1.5 minutes left for this live stream, and so I'm just wondering if it makes more sense to do the questions in part 2.
Yeah, let's do that way. Let's do that way.
Okay. All right. So everyone, join us for part 2 in just a couple minutes. Everyone watching live, you'll see the link on the description. Otherwise, scroll down and there will be a link to part 2. All right. Love and light of the Infinite Creator. Yeah. All right. So